you doing?
Good morning. We are all fine.
So what I did, which is a little bit different from what I've done in the past, the request was to talk about change management. So change and requirements in the waterfall scenario as well as agile. And I realized when I was putting together the slides that we had done this training about 6 months ago in our group. So I reposted that video for you guys to watch. I wonder if how many of you guys have watched that video. Has anybody gone through that video yet? What I posted last night.
Yeah, I'm halfway through.
Okay, perfect. So generally, as you know, waterfall is very, very linear, right? And agile is very nimble, meaning that you can introduce change if there's a tolerance level for it. So typically, if you're working in the waterfall scenario and we have change that needs to be introduced, um, and typically change, we have to follow a formal process called the change request, right? Like this, there's typically a change request board. And even if it's not formal, there's typically a process that you have to follow. And that process may change depending on the company that you're at, right? So one company A could have a very, very formal change request process, and company B may have an informal change request process. And the only difference is company A that has a very formal change request process may have, identified the steps that you need to follow to introduce a change. And company B, who also has like a change request, but an informal process, you'll probably have to, get in touch with the dev managers and then the QA managers and your sponsors to make sure that the change is accepted across the entire organization. So even when there's an informal process and the changes introduced, which is typically while coding has started, like development work has started, or even testing has started, we have to make sure that all team members involved in that change are aware and approve that change, because oftentimes change requests cause rework and development or testing, and will maybe in addition to scope and such. So that's typically how you follow change request in the waterfall, because everything is scoped out ahead of time. Everything is, all those timelines are identified ahead of time. So that's why you have to follow like a process to get changes implemented. So any questions on the waterfall? And I know this is high level and without the slide. So let me know if you have any questions on the waterfall for now. Okay, and in Agile, things are a little bit easier just because not everything is defined at the very beginning. There's a question here from Jude. Jude, you said, what is the role of the project manager in a change request? So it could vary from organization to organization. Sometimes the BA will lead the change request, sometimes the PM will. From a PM standpoint, anytime there's a change request in the organizations that I worked at as a PM, I've been the one to kind of communicate the change request to the team, to the leadership, to the sponsor, to the other managers like of a dev and a QA team, just so that everybody's aware. We get in a room, we talk about the change, and at that point, what I'm looking for are level of estimates from the dev and the QA team to see like how much rework would this cause, what the new timelines may look like if we accept this. And once we have that information, Jude, right, once I know from a development and testing standpoint how much time it's going to be deviating from the original timelines, I can take that back to my sponsor or to my manager and say, okay, well, if we really, really want this, this is what it's going to take. So, are we going to move forward with this or not? So based on that, that's how we make a decision. Yeah. Any other questions before I move on to Agile? Okay, so Agile is a little bit more flexible just because, typically we have something called a product backlog that gives you a high level, or it may have lots of the functionality that we want to introduce to a project, but it's not all pretty well defined and it's not prioritized, meaning that in a product backlog, we typically don't know, 1 to 2 sprints ahead of what's going on, right? Of what functionality we want to put in place. And so for that reason, if a product owner came to me or one of the stakeholders came to the project team and said, okay, we really want this functionality to go into the next sprint. So what we would typically do at that time is start to work on user stories and start to flush out that functionality to understand what that means to the project team. So for example, if they said, hey, Sarbjeet, we're working on a sprint right now, for the next sprint, we want this functionality. As a project manager or a scrum master or a business analyst, I would have to say, we have to figure out what that looks like, right? So if the user stories are not well defined, we typically don't accept anything to the sprint, right? Until as a team, we've vetted the functionality and we know what that means. So it may not be the next sprint, it may be the following sprint where we, accept that functionality, but that flexibility is there to have somebody, a sponsor or a stakeholder come to the project team and say, we want to add this to the product backlog and we want to prioritize it as high, meaning that's when our project team will start to define those user stories. Our developers and our QA folks will start to think about what's needed to implement this functionality in the next 2 to 3 sprints. Okay, another question is, who's fully in charge of maintaining the product backlog? Typically, the book definition is that it's the product owner. Generally, it's the project team that's, managing the product backlog, because depending on the organization and depending on the product owner that you're working with, roles and responsibilities may shift a little bit. I've seen product owners that are very, very, very involved and they own and manage the product backlog. And I've seen product owners who are not as involved, and therefore either the Scrum master will own it, meaning they'll be the ones to make sure that the user stories are getting defined and things like that. But generally, it's the project team that, it's either the Scrum master or the product owner. But generally in Agile, it's a team commitment and a team environment. So I would say it's the team that manages the product backlog. Okay, any questions, you guys?
So hi, Sarabjit.
Hi, Rajeshwari.
I have a question. So for example, like as you said in Agile, I know it's very flexible for changes. But what if the sprint has started and you are almost, usually the sprints are very short, right? Either 2 weeks or 4 weeks, 3 weeks. And what if the 3/4 of the development is done and they are almost in the testing phase? And I saw your video yesterday, and then you said that you also experience some kind of sometimes, critical bug comes and the change has to be incorporated. So in those situations, how do we handle the sprint? Meaning, will the sprint be, it is a critical, so the change has to be taken in.
Yeah.
And the sprint is almost 3/4 or halfway done. Do we continue with the sprint in order to incorporate it? And there may not be time for the, doing all those changes and then do the testing and then the release.
Yeah.
Or do we cancel the sprint at that point?
So typically you'll have, when you're working in an Agile environment, you won't have just one developer and one QA. You may have just one QA, but you'll typically have more than one developer. And what that means is that when a critical bug, now that's like really high stakes, meaning that this is a bug that we have to fix. It's important to the product, it's important to the company. And for that reason, what may happen is we'll have one developer dedicated to that bug only, and the things that he was working on or she was working on. So typically development is done and then QA is getting started, right? So generally we'll have to assess where the team is and what makes sense for the team. So for example, if we have when we have more than one developer, we can assign that bug to either the developer that worked on it or another developer if they're done with their own user stories. So what at that point will happen is if everybody agrees, the product owner agrees, the project team agrees that this is a critical bug that we have to get to, then we may leave 1 or 2 user stories undone from that sprint and continue working on that defect to make sure that we're fixing it right away. Right? So you would never cancel an entire sprint just because you have to work on one defect. You would continue, the project team continues as planned, and 1 or 2 resources from the project team may then be just dedicated on that bug and bring that bug into our sprint. So that way we, fix it and it's something that is released with that sprint. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so meaning even if that particular functionality, whichever we are trying to do a change, if it has dependencies also,
Yeah.
then for example, if the sprint might take a longer incorporating these dependencies and everything, still we would be committed to the end goal, like whatever is the sprint is scheduled for.
No. So that's a misconception, right? So typically, let's say if we at the beginning of the sprint are committed to 10 user stories, right? And towards the middle, or even let's say a bug is introduced and we have to get to it. That doesn't mean that all those 10 user stories have to be completed at the sprint, right? Because we're now changing direction during the sprint, what will happen is we'll identify which user stories can go on to the next sprint. So we'll move those user stories to the following sprint to give the team time to work on those on that defect and anything that's dependent on it. So sometimes when you have a defect, you have to do regression testing and make sure that there's, as you said, there's no impacts downstream or upstream, right? So that takes time. So if the project team decides that we want to take on this sprint, and if it's critical to the product or the company, we will then move some of the sprints that user stories that were supposed to be done in that sprint to the following sprint. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Usually what I've seen is that in a situation, when COVID just first happened, I was working for a healthcare company and we were working on releasing an app for, to track COVID and to track, testing centers and things like that. And we were committed to, let's say, maybe 8 user stories by the end of the sprint. And typically when a bug, when we discover that there's a bug, the project team takes on the bug and the additional work, right? So generally you'll see people working more than the 8-hour shift that, is typically seen in the industry. But that again, is company by company, project team by project team. But generally, if we're adding work to the sprint, we have the flexibility to move something that we had put into the sprint to the following sprint that we'll be working on. So we'll put those user stories back to the project backlog. When we do planning for the next sprint, we'll bring those in to the following sprint. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Great questions. Really good questions. Any other questions you guys may have?
So the same process applies even though if it's not a bug, even a stakeholder, one of the stakeholders comes in and then say like, we need this change.
No,
Okay.
we will not do that. Just because user stories are not well defined, the acceptance criteria is not well defined, we will never take on a new functionality in the middle of a sprint.
Even if the stakeholder is very, particular, saying like this is a critical, like we have to incorporate this feature.
No, because right, like I said, unless a user stories and acceptance criteria, because the project team doesn't know what they're doing, they would have to stop work. And this is where your product owner and your Scrum Master will help you out, right? They will be the ones to protect the project team, the developers, the QA folks, because generally when you're talking about changing direction for the team, that takes time, right? For a developer to stop what they're doing, start something else, start from scratch. That takes time away from the project team. and that generally is not well accepted across the industry. So sprints are 2 weeks. What's another week or two for this new function? It can't be that critical. Otherwise, we would have been working on it.
So
So
irrespective at what stage it's being addressed, for example, even at the beginning, we have started the sprint, but just very, very early, like where
no,
we can even change still. Okay.
no, no, not unless the only again, company to company may differ. In my experience, that's a big no, that you don't accept anything into the sprint unless, when the sprint has started, you don't interrupt the project team and the momentum that the team has. You
Okay.
may, at that point, if they're coming to you and say it's super, super critical, as a scrum master or product owner, you may say, okay, let's work on the requirements and we'll pull it into the next sprint, which is in 2 weeks, because you still need time to develop those user stories, define, what this functionality needs to do. Sometimes you need to do, UX design. So you may say, okay, yes, let's work on it without, putting it into the sprint doesn't help anybody. We're not ready for that functionality to be developed.
Got it. Thanks.
Sorry, I just have a question. How do you deal with the conflict that comes with that? So you've got, let's say, 2 to 3 stakeholders that have conflicting views about a particular functionality that needs to be added, and each one says that that particular functionality is a priority and it's of high urgency. How do you as a BA kind of deal with such conflicts?
So typically, the way to handle this is different based on the environment that you're in. So if you're in the agile environment, your product owner should be helping with that issue. And if you're in the waterfall environment, your project manager should be helping you, right? So in the waterfall, conflicting requirements happens a lot. And I've talked about this in a number of trainings. And when there is a conflict, you generally have to pull all the stakeholders into a room and decide on a decision point or direction moving forward. If you're not able to resolve that, then you have to raise it to leadership, right? So their managers and your manager as well. But that's only after you've tried your best to resolve the conflict, right? That's the waterfall scenario. And that's if you're having conflicting requirements. In the agile environment, if there's a conflict in when a functionality is getting released, right? What you may want to do is if you have an active product owner, then raise it to them. Usually they'll be involved and they have to make a decision, right? For the project team, from our standpoint, we're just concerned about getting the requirements, assessing how long they will take, and putting them into sprints based on how long something will take, right? So for a BA or a Scrum Master, our goal is to, as a project team, identify the next things, the high priority things on the product backlog that we want to release, right? So work with our team to get level of effort from our dev and our QA, so that way we're not overburdening our team to deliver this functionality. Now, in the agile environment, if you have stakeholders that are in conflict of when a certain functionality should go through, and if your product owner is not highly involved, I would have to raise that to leadership. Unless we can get all the requirements and provide LOEs, which takes a lot of time, right? Agile is known as just-in-time requirements, just-in-time functionality, which means that you're generally not defining user stories to the max detail, maybe 1 to 2 sprints ahead of when that functionality needs to go in, right? And a particular functionality may span over more than 1 sprint. So if in the agile environment, you're tasked to define functionality for 3 or 4 features, then you're kind of like in a waterfall scenario, which means that you're defining requirements way ahead of time, right? So going back to your question, if there is a conflict and your product owner is not highly involved, raise it to your leadership to, get help and make a decision on which features and functionalities are the most important to the product.
Thank you.
All right, guys, we have 4 minutes left. Any other questions? All right, then. Please watch the video. I posted it. We did that training maybe 6 months ago. There was lots of great questions during that training, so I left all those questions in there to help reinforce the topic. And as soon as I have my other laptop, I will post those slides in the group for you guys. Okay. All right. You guys know where to find me. And then let me know what other topics you guys like me to cover on these weekend trainings. We're not doing training every weekend in the group anymore. I'm trying to do at least 2 per month. So give me those topics and I'm more than happy to provide the training to you guys. And I'm so glad that you guys are in this group. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Thank you. Talk
Thank
to you
you.
guys later. Bye.
Bye.